Samantha Reyes was born in 1995 in Los Angeles, a city known for its sprawling urban landscape and stark social divides. She grew up in a neighborhood marked by economic struggles, where many families, including her own, lived paycheck to paycheck. Samantha's childhood was shaped by hardship. Her parents, both working multiple low-wage jobs, tried their best to provide for her and her two younger siblings. However, the stresses of living in poverty often overshadowed the potential for any meaningful success or advancement in life. Despite these challenges, Samantha showed promise. She was a bright, creative young woman, with a keen interest in graphic design. In high school, she excelled in art and technology classes, often staying up late to perfect her designs. Teachers recognized her talent, and she received praise for her innovative projects. Still, the reality of her environment weighed heavily on her ambitions. Growing up in a neighborhood where violence was not uncommon, and where opportunities for higher education were scarce, Samantha's dreams of becoming a graphic designer seemed distant and out of reach. Her family struggled to keep their heads above water, often forced to make difficult decisions about where to allocate their meager resources. Samantha, with the pressure mounting around her, began to feel the weight of a future that looked increasingly bleak. At 18, she graduated from high school, but the ceremony felt more like an end than a beginning. There was no college waiting for her, no job offers on the horizon, just the harsh reality of trying to survive in a city where the odds were stacked against her. Unable to find steady work after high school, Samantha felt trapped. Her aspirations, once full of promise, now seemed like fantasies. Desperation began to take hold. In an attempt to make ends meet, she became involved in a minor robbery, a decision that would change the course of her life forever. The robbery, though small and non-violent, resulted in her arrest and conviction as an accomplice. At the age of 18, Samantha was sentenced to 3 years in the Westbrook Correctional Facility. Westbrook was known as a tough and unforgiving place, a maximum security prison where violence and hostility were part of the daily routine. It was not a place for someone like Samantha, who had always been introverted and peaceful, preferring to keep to herself rather than get involved in the aggressive, often brutal culture that dominated prison life. In prison, survival meant playing by the rules of the strongest, and Samantha was quickly introduced to the harsh realities of her new world. The transition to incarceration was devastating for Samantha. She felt the sting of rejection and isolation as she tried to navigate the difficult prison dynamics. Other inmates were wary of her, seeing her as weak and vulnerable due to her lack of street smarts and survival instincts. Her days were spent in a state of constant fear, trying to avoid confrontation and finding ways to stay out of trouble. Despite her intelligence, her skills as a graphic designer, and her natural creativity, none of those qualities seemed to matter in the cold, unforgiving environment of Westbrook. The world she had known, one where she could dream of a better life, seemed a distant memory. At first, Samantha focused on keeping a low profile, blending into the background and avoiding attention. But that strategy soon became difficult. In a facility as large and chaotic as Westbrook, it was nearly impossible to stay unnoticed. As days passed, Samantha began to realize that the most important thing in prison was power: who had it, who didn't, and who was willing to do anything to maintain or gain it. That was when she first met David Collins, a correctional officer who would change the course of her life. Collins was 38 years old, tall and imposing, with a demeanor that alternated between cold professionalism and moments of surprising warmth. To Samantha, his kindness seemed like a lifeline. He began to offer small favors, a sympathetic word here and there, and seemed to take an interest in her well-being. At a time when she was feeling most alone and vulnerable, David appeared as a rare point of comfort in an otherwise harsh and unforgiving place. The officer's attention felt comforting, even though Samantha had been warned by others to be cautious. Inmates often told her to stay away from officers like Collins, who had a reputation for using their power over prisoners for personal gain. But at the time, Samantha, desperate for a sense of connection, dismissed these warnings. She didn't want to believe that someone like David Collins could be a threat. To her, he seemed different, compassionate, even empathetic to her plight. Over time, Samantha began to rely more and more on David. He seemed to take a special interest in her, offering to help her with her assignments, giving her extra time in the library, and even providing her with small luxuries, things that were rare in the prison world. Samantha, eager to feel like she mattered, started to trust him, slowly lowering her guard. She began to confide in him about her struggles, about her difficult childhood, her dreams, and her fears. In turn, David appeared to listen attentively, offering words of encouragement and understanding. However, what Samantha couldn't see was that David Collins was not the benevolent figure he appeared to be. His kindness was a facade, a calculated move designed to manipulate and control her. As the months passed, his gestures of kindness became more frequent, and so too did the subtle shifts in his behavior. He began to exert power over Samantha in ways that would soon become clear. David started to demand more from her, small, seemingly innocent requests at first, like asking her to deliver messages or do personal favors. He made it clear that he expected something in return for his help. At first, Samantha didn't understand the implications. She was simply grateful for his attention, believing he had her best interests at heart. But soon, those small favors escalated. David's requests became more personal, more invasive. He began to take advantage of her vulnerability, making her feel indebted to him. And Samantha, too afraid to say no, found herself in a position where she was being controlled by a man who had initially appeared to be her protector. What had started as an innocent relationship of trust and dependency gradually morphed into something far darker. Samantha's innocence made her a target for manipulation, and David Collins knew exactly how to exploit it. As his demands grew, Samantha's sense of self-worth diminished, and the walls of her prison, both physical and emotional, tightened around her. But it wasn't until the abuse began that Samantha realized the full extent of the trap she had fallen into. As Samantha spent more time at Westbrook Correctional Facility, she couldn't help but notice the changes in her daily routine. At first, she had been grateful for David's attention, but now she felt an undercurrent of something darker beneath his charm. His demeanor had shifted from friendly and paternal to commanding and possessive. Where once he had helped her with small favors, his requests had become more personal, more frequent, and more intrusive. Samantha had always been introverted, someone who preferred the quiet company of her thoughts rather than engaging in the cutthroat environment of prison politics. But now, David had begun to demand her presence in ways she could not avoid. She was summoned to his office, asked to do tasks that were beyond her job description, and even received special privileges that other inmates did not. In the beginning, she didn't question it, as it all seemed like small kindnesses, gifts that came with an implied gratitude. But those kindnesses were becoming harder to ignore. David Collins's manipulation was subtle, but it was growing bolder with each passing day. The favors he once offered, such as letting her take extra time in the library or allowing her to access restricted areas, were now paired with expectations. He started to request that she meet him in secluded parts of the facility, away from the watchful eyes of other inmates and guards. At first, it was to give her special assignments, but as time went on, the nature of those tasks began to change. He would linger near her, touch her shoulder or her arm, and often compliment her appearance, calling her beautiful, innocent, and special in ways that seemed to feed her fragile self-esteem. Samantha, caught in the web of her own isolation, began to believe these reassurances. She had never been shown much affection in her life, her parents had always been too busy to provide emotional support, and her social circle had been limited. As a result, David's kind words filled a void she hadn't even realized existed. She began to believe that, in a world full of indifference and hostility, David was the one person who truly saw her. She felt like she owed him everything. But that feeling of indebtedness soon gave way to confusion and discomfort. In late 2016, things started to take a darker turn. David began to pressure Samantha into more intimate encounters. What began with casual touches on her arm and shoulder became more overt. He began asking her to meet him alone in his office during off hours, telling her it was for her own good, claiming that he was looking out for her. Initially, Samantha resisted, but David's persistent words and the psychological manipulation began to wear her down. He told her that their relationship was special, that no one would understand the bond they shared, and that he was doing everything in his power to protect her from the dangers that lurked within the walls of the prison. The warning signs, which others had tried to alert her to, started to make more sense in retrospect. Inmates who had witnessed David's behavior had tried to intervene, warning Samantha that he was dangerous, that he was using his position of authority to exploit her. But Samantha, deeply isolated and unable to fully grasp the depth of the manipulation, brushed them off. David had been the one person who had treated her with kindness and respect in a place where such things were rare. How could he, the man who had shown her such compassion, possibly be a threat? By early 2017, the abuse had become undeniable. David's advances had escalated to the point where he would forcibly touch her, kiss her, and make sexual demands. At first, Samantha tried to push him away, to tell him to stop, but he would always find a way to convince her that it was her fault, telling her that she was too sensitive, that she was overreacting. He played on her fears, convincing her that if she refused him, her life in prison would become even more unbearable. His words echoed in her mind, "You don't want to make enemies here. You don't want to be alone. I'm the only one who understands you." The more David manipulated her, the more trapped Samantha felt. Her sense of self-worth, already fragile due to her circumstances, crumbled under the pressure. She began to believe that maybe he was right, that without his protection, she would be nothing. She was isolated in the prison, with no friends to confide in, no one to turn to. Every time she tried to speak out, her fears of retaliation and punishment silenced her. The power dynamics in prison were brutal, and Samantha understood all too well that challenging an officer, especially one with as much influence as David, could be catastrophic. At the same time, the psychological toll of David's manipulation was becoming overwhelming. Samantha had always been a quiet and reserved individual, but the trauma she was enduring started to break down her spirit. She became more withdrawn, her once bright eyes clouded with anxiety and fear. She stopped participating in the activities she used to enjoy, like drawing and designing. Her notebooks, which were once filled with artistic sketches and creative ideas, were now filled with scribbled, fragmented thoughts and despairing entries. In her diary, she began to document the horrors she was enduring, writing about her feelings of helplessness, fear, and isolation. But she could not bring herself to share the truth with anyone, not the guards, not her fellow inmates, and certainly not David, whose control over her was growing tighter with each passing day. The more Samantha tried to resist, the more brutal David became. He would punish her with extra work assignments, threaten to harm her if she spoke out, and make her feel as if she were completely alone in the world. Every effort to escape his grasp only made things worse. Her body and mind became a battleground where she struggled to hold on to the remnants of who she once was. She began to distance herself from the few inmates who had tried to warn her, unable to bear the thought of being seen as weak or fragile in a place like Westbrook. She wanted to believe that things could improve, that somehow the man who had been kind to her at first could still be saved. But deep down, she knew the truth: David had no intention of ever letting her go. As her isolation grew, so did her torment. Her once bright, ambitious spirit was now consumed by fear and shame. She started to feel as if she were nothing more than an object for David's pleasure, a piece of property to be controlled and discarded at will. The sense of helplessness she felt became all-consuming, and she began to believe that there was no way out. Every door seemed locked. Even if she could summon the courage to speak out, who would listen? Who could she trust? The horrors of her situation began to weigh heavier on her, until the pressure became too much to bear. By mid-2017, Samantha was physically and emotionally exhausted. The abuse, both mental and physical, had drained her to the point where she no longer recognized the person she had once been. She had become a shadow of her former self, lost in the twisted world that David had created for her. Yet, despite everything, she still couldn't bring herself to give up hope completely. She clung to the fragile thread of belief that maybe, just maybe, someone would believe her. But that hope was quickly fading, and so was her will to fight. As the months passed, the torment Samantha endured in the Westbrook Correctional Facility continued to escalate, yet she found herself increasingly isolated from any possible support. She had become a prisoner not only to the walls of the facility but also to the psychological grip that David Collins had over her. The physical abuse was brutal, but it was the emotional manipulation that was slowly eroding her spirit, leaving her powerless and broken. Samantha began to realize that the small flickers of hope she had once held were fading. She had tried to talk to other inmates, those who might understand, those who could offer advice or help, but the overwhelming fear of retaliation silenced her voice. Prison was a place where loyalty could be bought, where friendships were fickle, and trust was a luxury few could afford. Inmates who had witnessed David's behavior toward Samantha had already warned her, but they too were afraid to act openly. Prison life was governed by a harsh code, and those who dared to challenge authority often faced brutal consequences. The idea of standing up against an officer, especially one as influential as David, was not just terrifying, it was practically suicidal. One afternoon, while cleaning the mess hall, Samantha overheard a conversation between two inmates. They spoke in hushed tones, but the words that reached her ears were chilling. One of them said, "David has his favorites, you know. If you're not one of them, you better watch your back." Samantha, still naive and hopeful, tried to brush it off. But deep down, she knew the truth, she was not one of David's favorites in the way she had hoped. She had become an object of possession, a vulnerable target for his manipulation. As her isolation deepened, the pressure began to take its toll on Samantha's mental health. Her once peaceful, introverted nature was replaced with constant anxiety, self-doubt, and fear. She stopped attending group activities, no longer wanted to engage with the other women at the facility, and withdrew into herself even more. Every time she looked around, she felt like the walls were closing in. The burden of keeping David's secrets weighed heavily on her. He had warned her repeatedly that if she told anyone, her life would become unbearable. The other inmates, who had once been her only source of companionship, now seemed distant and indifferent, unwilling to risk their own safety for hers. Samantha's emotional toll was compounded by the fear that had taken hold of her. The power dynamics in prison were unforgiving, and the staff, like David, were often the ones who controlled access to safety and well-being. She had heard of other women who had tried to speak out, who had been silenced or intimidated into submission. The idea that someone might take her seriously seemed almost laughable. Every time she considered telling another inmate or even an authority figure, she was reminded of the harsh consequences she could face. The cycle of fear and powerlessness was suffocating, and each day felt like a lifetime spent in agony. In a fleeting moment of clarity, Samantha tried to reach out for help. One evening, as she sat in the prison library, she found the courage to write a letter, something she had never done before. She poured out her heart in the letter, recounting the abuse, the manipulation, and the unrelenting grip David had on her. She described how he had forced her into sexual acts, how his kindness had been a mere facade to conceal his darker motives. The words came pouring out like a dam that had finally broken, and for the first time in a long time, she felt as though she might be able to escape the nightmare she was trapped in. The letter was addressed to the prison's internal counselor, a woman named Andrea Martinez, who was known to be sympathetic toward inmates facing abuse. Samantha's hands trembled as she sealed the envelope, but she knew that this was her only chance. She walked carefully to the counselor's office, making sure no one was watching, and slipped the letter into the slot in the door. For a brief moment, she dared to hope that someone would believe her, that someone would finally step in and end her suffering. But as the hours and days passed with no response, her hope turned to despair. What she hadn't counted on was how well David had ingrained himself into the system. He had friends in high places, people who trusted him and saw him as a model correctional officer. When the letter was discovered by one of his colleagues, it was quickly dismissed as a fabrication. David had already begun planting seeds of doubt in the minds of the prison staff, making sure that anyone who might have stood up for Samantha would hesitate. He knew how the system worked, and he had manipulated it to his advantage. The letter Samantha had written, in her desperation, was used against her. It was twisted into a story of attention-seeking behavior, and soon, the whispers among the staff began to paint Samantha as a troublemaker, a prisoner who was trying to stir up trouble for no reason. Days turned into weeks, and Samantha's situation only worsened. The silence that followed her attempt to seek help was deafening. It was as though the world outside of her suffering had turned a blind eye. Her diary, once filled with hopeful sketches and dreams, was now filled with angry, fragmented entries. The pages were no longer just about her life in prison, but about the crushing despair she felt. She wrote about how she could no longer trust anyone, not even herself. The girl who had once dreamed of being a graphic designer, who had once wanted to build a life for herself, seemed like a distant memory. The future she had imagined had been stolen by the hands of a man who had abused his power for far too long. Samantha's emotional exhaustion was visible to anyone who looked closely. Her once bright eyes were dull, her posture slouched, and her face drawn with the weight of her experiences. Even the small pleasures she had once found in her creative pursuits were gone. She had no energy to draw, no desire to engage with the outside world. The world within Westbrook had become her entire existence, and it was a world of fear, pain, and hopelessness. In this state of utter isolation, she had one final thought: escape. Not physical escape, as she had no means to break free from the prison's walls, but a more permanent escape. She began to entertain the idea of ending her life. The thought wasn't new, it had been creeping into her mind for months, but now it seemed like the only way out. The constant abuse, the betrayal, the hopelessness, it was all too much to bear. Samantha began to believe that there was no future for her, no path forward that didn't lead to more suffering. The only way to end the nightmare was to make it stop altogether. But even as she contemplated this, a small voice inside her whispered that it wasn't the answer. Maybe, just maybe, there was still someone out there who could help her. Maybe, someone would finally listen. However, that voice grew quieter with each passing day, as the darkness of her reality continued to close in around her. By November 2017, Samantha was no longer the young woman who had once dreamed of becoming a graphic designer. She had withered under the constant weight of emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. The bright spark of ambition and hope that had once defined her seemed like a distant memory. Samantha had long since lost any belief in a future for herself. The prison walls, both literal and psychological, had closed in around her, leaving no room for escape. For months, she had struggled with the thought of ending her life. Her diary entries had become increasingly desperate and fragmented. The writing, once filled with hopes and dreams, was now filled with pain, confusion, and a haunting sense of despair. She had tried to reach out for help, but each attempt had been met with indifference or outright dismissal. The letter to the counselor, which she had hoped might be a lifeline, had been ignored, and the prison staff had turned a blind eye to her cries for help. On the morning of November 12, 2017, Samantha's life would come to a tragic and irreversible end. She was found dead in her cell, the victim of what appeared to be suicide by hanging. It was a method of escape, a final act of control in a life that had been stripped of it at every turn. Her body was discovered by a fellow inmate, who immediately alerted the guards. The news of Samantha's death spread quickly through the facility, but the real story of what had led to her tragic end was far more complicated than the prison staff would ever acknowledge. Samantha's death did not go unnoticed. Inside the prison, the other inmates were devastated by her passing. Many of them knew the truth about what had been happening to her. They had seen the changes in her, the isolation, the bruises that couldn't be explained. They had heard the whispers about David Collins, the correctional officer who had been the source of her suffering. The prison had long been a place where inmates had to protect themselves, but the betrayal they felt for what had happened to Samantha was palpable. There was anger, frustration, and a desire for justice. But there was also fear. Fear of retaliation, fear of becoming another victim, fear that speaking out would only make things worse. Samantha's death was initially dismissed by the prison as a tragic, isolated incident. The official report stated that she had taken her own life in the early hours of the morning, with no mention of the abuse she had endured at the hands of a correctional officer. The prison's administration did not conduct an immediate investigation into the circumstances surrounding her death, instead framing it as an inevitable result of her mental health issues and her history of self-harm. The narrative they presented was one of inevitability, a troubled young woman who had spiraled into despair and ultimately made the tragic choice to end her life. But the other inmates knew better. They knew what had really happened. They knew that Samantha had been victimized by someone who was supposed to protect her. And slowly, the truth began to surface. In the weeks following Samantha's death, the other inmates began to speak out. They came forward with stories of what they had witnessed during the months leading up to her suicide. Many of them had seen David Collins take advantage of his position as a guard, using his power to manipulate, intimidate, and sexually abuse Samantha. They had watched as she became increasingly withdrawn, as her spirit was broken by the man who was supposed to be a figure of authority. They spoke of the fear that had prevented them from intervening, the fear that they, too, would become targets if they stood up for Samantha. The other prisoners' testimony, along with security footage from the facility, eventually confirmed the grim truth. There was video evidence of David Collins entering Samantha's cell during the late hours of the night, on numerous occasions, and leaving her cell shortly before her body was discovered. The footage, combined with witness accounts, painted a clear picture of the abuse that had taken place. It was a damning indictment of both the prison's administration and the man who had been trusted to maintain order. The fallout from Samantha's death was swift and far-reaching. The prison system was rocked by the revelation that one of its own had been responsible for the abuse and death of an inmate. David Collins was arrested, charged with aggravated sexual assault and manslaughter. The case became a focal point for reform advocates, who called for greater accountability within the prison system and stronger protections for incarcerated women. It was a public reckoning that revealed the systemic failures that allowed abuse to thrive within the walls of correctional facilities. But even as justice seemed to be within reach, the damage had already been done. Samantha Reyes's life had been stolen from her, and her death had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system that was supposed to protect her. No amount of reform could bring her back. No court decision could erase the pain and suffering she had endured in her final months. In the aftermath of Samantha's death, her family was left to grapple with the devastating loss of their daughter. They had known she had faced challenges growing up, but they had never imagined that her struggles would lead her to a place like Westbrook, or that she would end up a victim of abuse behind bars. The grief they felt was compounded by the anger and frustration that came with knowing the circumstances of her death could have been avoided. Her parents spoke out publicly, demanding accountability from both the prison system and the people who had failed their daughter. They attended rallies, met with reform advocates, and joined the growing chorus of voices calling for changes to the way women in prison were treated. But for them, the fight for justice was never just about policy or reform. It was about ensuring that their daughter's story would not be forgotten, that her life, however brief, would matter. For the inmates at Westbrook, Samantha's death was a painful reminder of the harsh realities of prison life. It was a reminder of how easily a life could be crushed under the weight of systemic corruption, of how quickly a person could be forgotten when they were behind bars. And while some of them found solace in the fact that David Collins was finally held accountable, others knew that his arrest would not change the fundamental problems within the system. The fear, the violence, the abuse, it was all still there, lurking beneath the surface. But Samantha's story, though tragic, became a turning point. Her death sparked a wider conversation about prison reform, particularly in regard to the treatment of women in correctional facilities. Advocacy groups and activists pushed for changes, including better oversight, increased accountability for correctional officers, and stronger protections for inmates against sexual abuse. And while much work remained to be done, Samantha's story, her pain, her suffering, and ultimately her death, served as a painful but necessary catalyst for change.